Picture this: a packed auditorium, 189 witnesses holding their breath, and a moment that would change everything. What started as a routine training session was about to become the most talked about incident in military academy history. This isn't just a story about standing up to authority, it's about a young woman who refused to let anyone, regardless of rank, cross a line that should never be crossed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1994, and Sarah Mitchell had just entered her second year at the prestigious Westfield Military Academy. At 20 years old, she stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with an athletic build that came from years of competitive wrestling in high school. But it wasn't her physical strength that would define this moment. It was her unwavering determination to never back down from what was right. Sarah had grown up in a military family. Her father served 2 tours in Vietnam, her older brother was stationed in Germany, and her grandfather had fought in World War II. Military discipline, respect, and honor weren't just concepts to her. They were the foundation of everything she believed in. When she received her appointment to Westfield, it felt like destiny. She was going to follow in her family's footsteps and serve her country with pride. But Westfield Military Academy in the mid-1990s was still very much an old boys club. Women had only been admitted for 15 years, and many of the old guard faculty still viewed female cadets as an unwelcome experiment. The Academy's motto, honor, courage, truth, was prominently displayed everywhere, but for some, those words seemed to apply selectively. Captain Richard Brennan was one of those faculty members who had never quite adapted to the changing times. A 25-year veteran who had served in the Gulf War, Brennan commanded respect through intimidation rather than leadership. He was known for his harsh training methods, his explosive temper, and his particular disdain for what he called special accommodation cadets, his not-so-subtle code for women and minorities. Brennan stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed about 220 pounds, and had the kind of presence that could silence a room just by walking into it. His gray hair was always perfectly groomed, his uniform always immaculate, and his cold blue eyes seemed to look right through people. He had a reputation for breaking down cadets who didn't meet his standards, and he took particular pleasure in making life difficult for anyone he deemed unworthy of wearing the uniform. Sarah had encountered Captain Brennan multiple times during her first year, and each interaction had been more unpleasant than the last. He would single her out during formations, question her fitness reports despite her excellent performance, and make subtle comments about whether women really belong in military service. Other cadets noticed, other instructors noticed, but no one said anything. That was just how things worked with Captain Brennan. The tension between them had been building for months. During a particularly brutal training exercise the previous semester, Brennan had forced Sarah to repeat an obstacle course 7 times because, in his words, her form wasn't up to male standards. When she completed it perfectly on the 8th attempt, he told her she was still too slow and marked her down anyway. Sarah said nothing, did nothing. She just absorbed the unfairness and kept moving forward. Her fellow cadets respected her for that. They saw how she handled Brennan's targeted harassment with grace and determination. Many of them, both male and female, had experienced their own encounters with the captain's particular brand of leadership, but Sarah seemed to bear the worst of it. She became something of a symbol for the other cadets, proof that you could endure anything if you stayed true to your principles. But endurance has its limits, and everyone who knew Sarah could sense that she was approaching hers. Her roommate, Jennifer Walsh, later recalled that Sarah had been having trouble sleeping. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, and occasionally mutter things like, "There has to be a line somewhere," or "Someone needs to stand up to him eventually." The breaking point came during what should have been a routine hand-to-hand combat demonstration. Every Thursday afternoon, the second-year cadets gathered in the Academy's main gymnasium for defensive tactics training. It was a large, echoing space with bleachers that could hold about 200 people. On this particular Thursday, November 17th, 1994, the bleachers were packed with 189 cadets from various years who had come to watch the demonstrations. The session was supposed to be educational. Senior instructors would demonstrate various defensive and offensive techniques, and then cadets would practice in pairs under supervision. Captain Brennan was leading the session, along with two other instructors, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez and Major Thompson. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost festive. This was one of the more popular training sessions because it broke up the monotony of classroom instruction and physical conditioning. Sarah was sitting in the third row of bleachers with her usual group of friends when Captain Brennan called for volunteers to help demonstrate a new defensive technique he wanted to teach. The technique involved breaking free from various grabs and holds, practical skills that every officer needed to master. Several hands went up around the gymnasium, including Sarah's. But when Brennan's eyes landed on Sarah, something shifted in his expression. Later, witnesses would describe it as a look of cruel satisfaction, as if he had just spotted an opportunity he had been waiting for. Without hesitation, he pointed directly at her and said, "Cadet Mitchell, front and center." Sarah made her way down from the bleachers, her heart rate already beginning to elevate. She had participated in these demonstrations before, and they were usually straightforward and professional. But something about Brennan's tone, something about the way he was looking at her, made her uneasy. As she walked across the gymnasium floor, she could feel the eyes of 189 of her fellow cadets watching her every move.
As Sarah positioned herself in the center of the gymnasium, Captain Brennan began explaining the technique to the assembled cadets. His voice carried easily through the space, and he seemed to be enjoying having such a large audience for his demonstration. The technique, he explained, was called defensive disengagement, and it was designed to help officers break free from aggressive suspects who might try to grab them during confrontations. The key, Brennan said, pacing around Sarah like a predator circling its prey, is to remain calm under pressure. Too many officers panic when someone gets their hands on them, and that panic can get you killed. He stopped directly in front of Sarah and looked down at her with those cold blue eyes. Cadet Mitchell here is going to help us demonstrate what happens when someone doesn't follow proper defensive protocols. Something in his tone made Sarah's skin crawl. This wasn't going to be a normal demonstration. She could sense it in the way he was positioning himself, in the slight smirk that played at the corners of his mouth, in the way he was drawing out this moment for maximum effect. The other instructors, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez and Major Thompson, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. They stood off to the side, occasionally nodding as Brennan spoke. "Now," Brennan continued, "I'm going to grab Cadet Mitchell in various ways, and she's going to demonstrate the proper defensive responses. The first grab we'll practice is the shoulder grab." He moved behind Sarah and placed his hands on her shoulders in what appeared to be a normal training grip. But immediately, Sarah could feel that something was wrong. His grip was too tight, his fingers digging into her shoulders with unnecessary force. This wasn't a training grip. This was designed to cause discomfort, to intimidate. Sarah had been through enough of these demonstrations to know the difference, and she tensed slightly under his hands. The crowd of watching cadets couldn't see what she was feeling, couldn't understand that this had already crossed the line from training into something darker. "The mistake that many officers make," Brennan said, his voice now directly behind Sarah's ear, "is that they try to be too gentle, too accommodating. They forget that sometimes you have to use force to maintain respect." As he said this, his grip tightened even further, and Sarah had to bite back a gasp of pain. She tried to execute the standard defensive technique she had been taught, a quick shoulder roll to break the grip, but Brennan adjusted his hold to prevent her from completing the movement. This was completely against training protocols. In a proper demonstration, the instructor was supposed to allow the cadet to successfully demonstrate the defensive technique, but Brennan was actively preventing her from doing so, making her look incompetent in front of nearly 200 of her peers. "Try again," Brennan loudly said, and Sarah could hear the satisfaction in his voice. She attempted the shoulder roll a second time, and again, he adjusted his grip to block her. Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd of watching cadets. This wasn't how these demonstrations usually went. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez stepped forward slightly. "Captain Brennan," he said carefully, "perhaps we should—" "I've got this, sir. Cadet Mitchell just needs to learn that real-world situations aren't as easy as the textbook scenarios." He leaned closer to Sarah's ear and lowered his voice so that only she could hear him. "What's wrong, Mitchell? Can't handle a little pressure? Maybe you should have stayed home and played with dolls instead of trying to be a soldier." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. All the months of harassment, all the subtle put-downs, all the targeted discrimination suddenly crystallized into this moment. She could feel her face burning with humiliation and anger. Around her, 189 cadets were watching what they thought was a normal training demonstration, completely unaware that their fellow cadet was being psychologically tortured by an instructor who was supposed to be teaching and protecting her. Sarah tried the defensive move one more time, putting all her strength into it, but Brennan's grip only tightened further. She was trapped, humiliated, and completely at his mercy in front of nearly all of her peers. The gymnasium had gone quiet except for Brennan's voice as he continued his so-called instruction. "You see, class," he said, addressing the crowd while maintaining his painful grip on Sarah's shoulders. "This is what happens when someone isn't cut out for military service. They freeze up under pressure. They can't execute even the most basic defensive maneuvers." Each word was calculated to maximize Sarah's humiliation while maintaining plausible deniability. To most observers, it looked like a legitimate training exercise. But Sarah knew better. And, more importantly, she was done accepting it. "Sir," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the gymnasium, "you need to loosen your grip so I can demonstrate the proper technique." Brennan's hands stilled on her shoulders. "Are you giving me orders, cadet?" "No, sir. I'm requesting that you follow proper training protocols so that this demonstration can proceed as intended." A dangerous silence fell over the gymnasium. Even the cadets in the back rows could sense that something significant was happening. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez and Major Thompson exchanged worried glances. This was no longer a routine training session. This was a confrontation between a cadet and a superior officer in front of nearly 200 witnesses. Brennan's voice, when he spoke again, was barely controlled. "Cadet Mitchell, you will execute the defensive technique as instructed, or you will face disciplinary action for insubordination." Sarah took a deep breath. Every instinct told her to comply, to endure this humiliation like she had endured the others. That's what she had always done. That's what was expected of her. But something had changed in this moment. Maybe it was the presence of so many witnesses, maybe it was the realization that Brennan's behavior was escalating, or maybe it was simply that every person has a breaking point, and Sarah had finally reached hers. "Sir," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I cannot execute the technique properly while you are intentionally preventing me from doing so. This is not standard training protocol."
The words hung in the air like a challenge. 189 cadets sat in absolute silence, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. No one spoke to Captain Brennan like that. No one questioned his methods. No one challenged his authority. And certainly, no one did it in front of such a large audience. Brennan's hand slowly released Sarah's shoulders, and she could feel him moving around to face her. When she looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. It wasn't just anger, it was rage, pure and undiluted. His face had gone red, the veins in his neck were standing out, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that she could hear his teeth grinding together. "What did you just say to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly through the silent gymnasium. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez stepped forward more decisively this time. "Captain Brennan, perhaps we should move on to the next—" "Stay out of this, Martinez," Brennan snapped without taking his eyes off Sarah. "This cadet just questioned my training methods in front of the entire Corps. That kind of insubordination needs to be addressed immediately and publicly." Sarah stood her ground, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Sir, I was simply pointing out that proper training protocol requires—" "Shut up!"
Brennan's voice exploded across the gymnasium like a gunshot. Several cadets in the front rows actually flinched backward. "You do not speak unless I give you permission to speak. You do not question my methods, and you certainly do not embarrass me in front of my cadets." The transformation was complete. Whatever thin veneer of professionalism Brennan had been maintaining was gone. This was no longer about training or education. This was about power, dominance, and putting a young woman in what he considered to be her place. The watching cadets were no longer seeing a military instructor conducting a demonstration. They were seeing a man losing control. You want to know about real-world situations, Mitchell? You want to know what happens when someone disrespects authority? Let me show you. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for years afterward. According to the official incident report, Captain Brennan made aggressive physical contact with Cadet Mitchell. According to witness testimony, he raised his right hand and swung it towards Sarah's face in what could only be described as an attempt to slap her. But Sarah Mitchell had been wrestling since she was 12 years old. She had trained in hand-to-hand combat for over a year at the academy, and most importantly, she had spent months being pushed, prodded, and psychologically tormented by this man. When she saw his hand coming toward her face, every instinct she had developed over years of training kicked in automatically. Time seemed to slow down. Sarah could see Brennan's hand moving through the air, could see the shocked expressions on the faces of the cadets in the front row, could hear Lieutenant Colonel Martinez shouting something she couldn't quite make out. But her body was already reacting before her conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. Sarah ducked under Brennan's swing, grabbed his wrist with both hands, and used his own forward momentum against him. It was a textbook defensive move, exactly the kind of technique that was supposed to be demonstrated in this very class. But instead of releasing him once she had gained control, instead of stepping back and allowing the situation to de-escalate, Sarah continued the movement. In one fluid motion, she pivoted on her left foot, swept Brennan's legs out under him, and used a combination of leverage and his own body weight to send him crashing to the gymnasium floor. The sound of his body hitting the hardwood echoed through the silent space like a thunderclap. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 189 cadets stared in absolute shock at the sight of their feared instructor lying flat on his back on the gymnasium floor with 20-year-old Sarah Mitchell standing over him. It was as if the natural order of the universe had suddenly been turned upside down. Brennan lay there for several seconds, clearly stunned by what just happened. His perfectly pressed uniform was now wrinkled and disheveled, his gray hair was messed up, and there was a look of complete disbelief on his face. This was a man who had controlled every situation he had ever been in through intimidation and authority. And suddenly, he found himself on the ground, looking up at a young woman who he had tried to humiliate. The silence stretched on until it became almost unbearable. Then slowly, Brennan began to push himself up off the floor. Sarah took a step backward, but didn't retreat entirely. She kept her stance balanced, her hands ready, her eyes focused on his movements. If he came at her again, she would be ready. Brennan started to speak, his voice shaking with rage, but Lieutenant Colonel Martinez finally stepped between them. "That's enough," Martinez commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his senior rank. "Everyone remain in your seats. Captain Brennan, Major Thompson, we need to discuss the situation immediately." He looked at Sarah, who was still standing in a defensive posture. "Cadet Mitchell, you will remain exactly where you are until I give you further instructions." The gymnasium remained silent except for the sound of Brennan's heavy breathing as he got to his feet. His uniform was dirty, his dignity was shattered, and his authority had been challenged in the most public way possible. As he stood up, brushing dust off his jacket, Sarah could see that the dynamic between them had changed forever. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But as she looked around at the faces of her fellow cadets, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was a line that needed to be crossed.
The next few minutes were a blur of activity that would be dissected and analyzed in official reports for months to come. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez immediately took control of the situation with the kind of decisive leadership that had earned him his rank. Major Thompson began dispersing the crowd of stunned cadets, ordering them back to their dormitories while promising that they would receive official communication about the incident within 24 hours. But the cadets didn't want to leave. They lingered in the doorways, whispering among themselves, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Many of them had never seen a superior officer physically confronted by a subordinate, let alone a cadet. The rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of their lives at the academy had just been shattered before their eyes, and they weren't sure how to react. Sarah remained exactly where Lieutenant Colonel Martinez had ordered her to stay, but her mind was racing. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to wear off, and the full weight of what she had done was starting to sink in. She had just physically overpowered a superior officer in front of nearly 200 witnesses. In the military justice system, that could be considered assault on a superior officer, a charge that could result in court-martial, discharge, and potentially even prison time. Captain Brennan was also coming to grips with his new reality. As he straightened his uniform and tried to restore some semblance of his dignity, Sarah could see him calculating his next move. His face had gone from red with rage to pale with what she could only assume was the realization of how badly the situation could reflect on his career. He was a 25-year veteran who had just been humiliated by a 20-year-old cadet. That wasn't the kind of incident that military careers survived easily. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez positioned himself between Sarah and Brennan, clearly concerned that the confrontation might escalate further. "Captain Brennan," he said firmly, "I need you to step into my office immediately so we can discuss the situation. Major Thompson will escort Cadet Mitchell to the administrative holding area until we can conduct a full investigation." Brennan's eyes never left Sarah's face. "This cadet assaulted a superior officer," he said, his voice now controlled but filled with barely contained fury. "I want her arrested immediately and charged with insubordination, assault, and conduct unbecoming of an officer candidate." "Captain," Martinez replied carefully, "there were 189 witnesses to this entire incident. I think it would be wise for us to review all the facts before we determine what charges, if any, are appropriate." The subtle emphasis on all the facts was not lost on anyone present. Martinez had been in the military long enough to recognize when a situation was more complicated than it initially appeared. He had seen enough of the interaction between Sarah and Brennan to know that there were likely multiple sides to this story. As Major Thompson approached Sarah to escort her from the gymnasium, several things happened that would prove crucial to the investigation that followed. First, Cadet Jennifer Walsh, Sarah's roommate, stepped forward from the crowd of dispersing cadets. "Sir," she said to Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, "I have information that's relevant to this incident. Cadet Mitchell has been documenting a pattern of harassment from Captain Brennan for the past 8 months." Lieutenant Colonel Martinez turned to look at her. "What kind of documentation, Cadet Walsh?" She said, "Written records. Dates, times, descriptions of incidents and witness names. She's been keeping a detailed log because she was considering filing a formal complaint." This revelation hit the group like a bombshell. Sarah had never told anyone except Jennifer about the log she had been keeping. It started as a way for her to make sense of her interactions with Brennan, to determine whether she was being overly sensitive or if there really was a pattern of inappropriate behavior. Over the months, it had grown into a comprehensive record of harassment that would have impressed any investigator. Captain Brennan's face went white. "That's a lie," he said quickly. "This cadet is obviously trying to create false evidence to cover up her assault on a superior officer." But Lieutenant Colonel Martinez was already seeing the situation in a different light. He had been at the academy long enough to know that female cadets typically didn't resort to physical confrontation unless they had been pushed well beyond reasonable limits. And he had to admit that he had witnessed some concerning behavior from Brennan during the demonstration itself. "Cadet Walsh," Martinez said, "you will report to my office at 1400 hours with any documentation you mentioned.
Cadet Mitchell, you will be escorted to the administrative holding area, but you will not be placed under arrest at this time, pending a full investigation. Captain Brennan, I need to speak to you privately. Now." As the group began to disperse, something else happened that would prove crucial to the investigation that followed. Cadet Marcus Johnson, a third-year cadet who had been sitting in the front row, approached Major Thompson. "Sir," he said quietly, "I recorded part of the incident on my phone. I was supposed to be filming the demonstration for the Academy's training archive, but I kept recording when things got unusual." Major Thompson stared at him. "You have video footage of this entire incident?" "Yes, sir, from multiple angles. I wasn't the only one recording either. At least 3 other cadets have footage from different perspectives." This was yet another game-changing revelation. In 1994, personal recording devices were not as common as they would become in later decades, but the Academy had recently begun encouraging cadets to document training sessions for later review and analysis. What had started as an educational initiative was about to become the most important evidence in a major disciplinary investigation. As Sarah was escorted from the gymnasium, she could hear the buzz of conversation following her. Her fellow cadets were processing what they had witnessed, and the reactions were mixed. Some were clearly impressed by her courage in standing up to Brennan. Others were shocked that she had resorted to physical force. Others were worried about what this incident might mean for the Academy's reputation and their own futures. But there was one reaction that Sarah noticed as she walked through the corridors towards the administrative building. Several female cadets made eye contact with her and nodded slightly, a subtle gesture of support and understanding. They knew what it was like to deal with instructors who pushed boundaries, who made inappropriate comments, who seemed to take pleasure in making their lives more difficult than necessary.
The administrative holding area at Westfield Military Academy was a sterile, uncomfortable space designed to house cadets who were awaiting disciplinary proceedings. It consisted of a small room with a single desk, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the Academy's parade ground. Sarah had never been there before, but she had heard stories from cadets who had run afoul of the Academy's strict disciplinary code. As she sat alone in that room, waiting for what would surely be a life-changing investigation, Sarah's mind kept returning to the moment when she had seen Captain Brennan's hand coming toward her face. In the heat of the moment, her reaction had been purely instinctual. But now, with time to reflect, she realized that her response had been about more than just self-defense. It had been about dignity. It had been about refusing to accept that someone could treat her as less than human simply because of her gender or her rank. It had been about drawing a line in the sand and saying that there were some boundaries that could not be crossed, regardless of the consequences. But as she sat in that sterile room, Sarah also began to confront the very real possibility that her military career was over before it had really begun. Assault on a superior officer was one of the most serious charges in the military justice system. Even if she could prove that Brennan had been harassing her, even if she could demonstrate that she had acted in self-defense, the fact remained that she had physically overpowered a captain in front of nearly 200 witnesses. At the same time, across campus in Lieutenant Colonel Martinez's office, a very different conversation was taking place. Captain Brennan was attempting to control the narrative to present himself as the victim of an unprovoked assault by an unstable cadet. But Martinez was an experienced officer who had seen enough conflicts to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate the facts. "Captain Brennan," Martinez said, settling behind his desk, "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened in that gymnasium, from your perspective." Brennan straightened in his chair and launched into his prepared version of events. According to him, he had been conducting a routine training demonstration when Cadet Mitchell had become insubordinate and disrespectful. When he had attempted to maintain discipline, she had physically attacked him without provocation. "Sir," Brennan concluded, "this cadet clearly has anger management issues and poses a threat to the safety of other cadets and staff. I recommend immediate dismissal from the academy and criminal charges for assault." Martinez listened to the entire account without interruption, but his expression remained neutral. When Brennan finished speaking, Martinez leaned back in his chair and studied the captain's face carefully. "Captain,"
Martinez said finally. I was present for the entire incident. I saw you maintain an unnecessarily tight grip on Cadet Mitchell's shoulders. I heard you prevent her from executing the defensive techniques she was supposed to demonstrate, and I witnessed you raise your hand toward her face in what appeared to be an aggressive manner. Brennan's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. Sir, everything I did was within the bounds of standard training protocol. If Cadet Mitchell felt that my instruction was too intense, she should have requested permission to withdraw from the demonstration. Captain, in 23 years of military service, I have never seen a training demonstration where an instructor actively prevented a cadet from successfully completing the techniques being taught. That is not standard protocol. That is deliberate sabotage. The two men stared at each other across the desk, and Brennan realized that his version of events was not going to be accepted without serious scrutiny. Martinez had seen too much, witnessed too many of the inappropriate elements of the interaction to simply take Brennan's word for what had happened. Furthermore, Martinez continued, I'm informed that Cadet Mitchell has been documenting a pattern of harassment from you for the past 8 months. And apparently, we have video footage of today's incident from multiple angles. So I suggest that rather than trying to convince me of your version of events, you focus on preparing for what is likely to be a very thorough and very public investigation. Meanwhile, in another part of the administrative building, Cadet Jennifer Walsh was gathering the evidence that would prove to be crucial in the investigation that followed. Sarah's documentation of her interactions with Captain Brennan was far more comprehensive than anyone had realized. She had recorded not just dates and times, but specific quotes, descriptions of Brennan's behavior, and the names of witnesses who had observed various incidents. The log painted a picture of systematic harassment that went far beyond normal military discipline. There were records of Brennan making inappropriate comments about Sarah's physical appearance, questioning her fitness for military service based on her gender, and creating arbitrary obstacles to her success in various training programs. Most damning of all were entries describing incidents where Brennan had used physical contact in ways that seemed designed to intimidate rather than instruct. One entry, dated just 3 weeks before the gymnasium incident, described a training exercise where Brennan had forced Sarah to crawl through mud repeatedly, making comments about whether women were tough enough for military service. Another entry documented an incident where he had grabbed her arm with excessive force while criticizing her performance in front of other cadets. Preparing and narrating this story, it took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. As Jennifer compiled this evidence, she realized that what had happened in the gymnasium wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable culmination of months of escalating harassment. Sarah hadn't snapped randomly. She had been pushed systematically to her breaking point by an instructor who seemed to take pleasure in her discomfort. But perhaps the most significant development was happening in the Academy's media center, where Cadet Marcus Johnson and several other cadets were reviewing the video footage they had captured during the demonstration. The videos were even more damaging to Captain Brennan's case than anyone had anticipated. The videos clearly showed Brennan maintaining an inappropriately tight grip on Sarah's shoulders, preventing her from executing the defensive technique she was supposed to demonstrate. More importantly, they captured audio of his inappropriate comments and his explosive reaction when Sarah questioned his methods. Most damning of all, they provided clear evidence that Captain Brennan had raised his hand towards Sarah's face in an aggressive manner before she had responded with physical force.
By evening, word of the incident had spread throughout the entire academy. In the dining hall, in the dormitories, in study groups, and during evening formations, cadets talked about nothing else. The story grew and evolved with each telling, but the core facts remained consistent. Sarah Mitchell had physically overpowered Captain Brennan in front of nearly 200 witnesses, and now the entire academy was waiting to see what would happen next. The reactions among the cadet corps were as diverse as the cadets themselves. Many of the male cadets expressed shock and concern about a subordinate physically confronting a superior officer. They worried about the precedent this might set and the impact it could have on military discipline and hierarchy. Some viewed Sarah's actions as dangerously insubordinate, regardless of what had provoked them. But among many of the female cadets, the reaction was markedly different. They had their own stories of uncomfortable interactions with various instructors, their own experiences with comments and behaviors that crossed the line between legitimate training and personal harassment. For them, Sarah's actions represented something they had never seen before, a refusal to accept treatment that had been normalized for far too long. Cadet Lisa Chen, a first-year student who had been in the gymnasium that day, later described her feelings. I had been dreading Captain Brennan's classes since the beginning of the semester. He had a way of making comments that made me feel like I didn't belong here. When I saw Sarah stand up to him, it was like seeing someone fight back against something I had thought I just had to endure. Similar sentiments were being expressed in dormitory conversations throughout the campus. Female cadets began sharing their own experiences with harassment and inappropriate behavior from various instructors. What emerged was a pattern that went far beyond Captain Brennan, a systemic culture where certain faculty members felt entitled to treat female cadets differently, and where those cadets had been expected to simply accept it as part of their military education. But the investigation was moving quickly, and Lieutenant Colonel Martinez was determined to get to the truth before rumors and speculation could completely overtake the facts. He spent the evening reviewing the video footage, reading Sarah's documentation, and conducting preliminary interviews with key witnesses. The video evidence was particularly compelling. When viewed from multiple angles, it became clear that Captain Brennan's behavior during the demonstration had been inappropriate from the very beginning. His grip on Sarah's shoulders was visibly tighter than necessary, his comments were designed to humiliate rather than instruct, and his reaction to her questions was disproportionately aggressive. Most importantly, the video showed clearly that Brennan had raised his hand toward Sarah's face before she had responded with physical force. Under military regulations, any cadet had the right to defend themselves against unprovoked physical aggression, regardless of the rank of their attacker. Sarah's response, while dramatic, appeared to be legally justified self-defense. Martinez also spent time reviewing Sarah's academic and disciplinary records. What he found was a model cadet with excellent grades, superior fitness scores, and no history of behavioral problems. Her performance evaluations from other instructors were consistently positive, with multiple recommendations for leadership positions and advanced training opportunities. The contrast between Sarah's overall record and her interactions with Captain Brennan was stark and troubling. It suggested that the problem was not with Sarah's behavior or attitude, but with Brennan's treatment of her specifically. As Martinez compiled his preliminary findings, he realized that this case was likely to become a watershed moment for the Academy. The evidence suggested that a respected faculty member had engaged in systematic harassment of a female cadet and had potentially committed assault when she finally stood up to him. The implications for the Academy's culture, reputation, and future policies were enormous. At the same time, Sarah was dealing with her own crisis of confidence. As she sat alone in her dormitory room that evening, she found herself questioning everything. Had she overreacted? Could she have handled the situation differently? Was her military career over before it had really begun? Jennifer Walsh, her roommate, tried to provide support and perspective. Sarah, you did what anyone would have done in that situation. You defended yourself against someone who was trying to hurt you. That's not wrong. That's exactly what we're trained to do. But Sarah wasn't entirely convinced. The military culture she had grown up with emphasized respect for authority and chain of command above almost everything else. Even if Captain Brennan had been inappropriate, even if he had been harassing her for months, the fact remained that she had physically overpowered a superior officer. That was a line that most military personnel would never even consider crossing. Jen, Sarah said quietly, I've wanted to be a military officer since I was 8 years old. It's all I've ever planned to do with my life. What if I just threw it all away at a moment of anger? Jennifer sat down on her own bed and looked at her roommate with a mixture of admiration and concern. Sarah, do you remember what you told me on our first day here? You said that honor wasn't just about following orders. It was about doing what's right, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult.
Those words resonated with Sarah more than she expected. She had said exactly that, standing in the same room 15 months ago as they unpacked their belongings and prepared for their first year at the academy. But she had never imagined that living up to those principles would require her to physically confront a superior officer. As the evening wore on, Sarah began to receive unexpected support from an unlikely source. Other cadets started stopping by her room, ostensibly to check on her well-being, but really to express their admiration for what she had done. Many of them shared their own stories of uncomfortable interactions with Captain Brennan and other faculty members. Cadet Michael Torres, a third-year student who had been in Brennan's classes for 2 years, was particularly vocal in his support. "Sarah, that guy has been a bully for as long as I've been here. I've seen him target cadets, especially female cadets, for harassment that goes way beyond normal military discipline. You're the first person who's ever stood up to him, and honestly, it's about time someone did." Similar conversations were happening throughout the dormitory complex. What was becoming clear was that Captain Brennan's behavior towards Sarah was part of a larger pattern that many cadets had observed, but felt powerless to address. The rigid military hierarchy made it extremely difficult for cadets to file complaints against faculty members, especially when those complaints involved subjective issues, like inappropriate comments or excessive discipline. But Sarah's actions had changed the dynamic completely. By responding with physical force to Brennan's aggression, she had created an incident that could not be ignored or swept under the rug. There were too many witnesses, too much evidence, and too much attention for the Academy administration to handle this quietly. Word of the incident was already beginning to spread beyond the academy. Several cadets had contacted family members and friends, and social media was starting to buzz about the discussion about the confrontation. Military blogs and forums were picking up the story, and there was growing speculation about what the incident might mean for military culture more broadly. This external attention was creating additional pressure on the academy administration to handle the investigation fairly and transparently. Any appearance of bias or cover-up would likely result in national scrutiny and potentially serious consequences for the Academy's reputation and funding. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she realized that regardless of how the investigation concluded, her life at the Academy would never be the same. She had crossed a line that changed everything, not just for herself, but potentially for every cadet who would come after her. The question now was whether that change would be for the better or whether it would destroy everything she had worked so hard to achieve.
The next morning brought with it an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that permeated every corner of Westfield Military Academy. During morning formation, cadets whispered among themselves despite strict regulations against talking in ranks. During breakfast, conversation at every table seemed to center on the same topic. And in classrooms throughout the day, instructors found it difficult to maintain their students' attention as everyone wondered what was happening behind the closed doors of the administrative building. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez had spent most of the night reviewing evidence and preparing for what he knew would be one of the most important investigations of his career. The video footage, Sarah's documentation, and witness statements were painting a picture that was far more complex than a simple case of insubordination. This was starting to look like a case study in institutional harassment and the failure of systems designed to protect cadets from abuse. The formal investigation began at 0800 hours, with Martinez interviewing Sarah in the presence of her appointed advocate, Major Patricia Williams. Major Williams was one of the Academy's few female field-grade officers, and her presence was both a comfort to Sarah and a signal that the administration was taking the allegations of harassment seriously. Cadet Mitchell, Martinez began, "I want you to understand that this investigation will be conducted fairly and thoroughly. You are not under arrest, but you are facing potential charges of assault on a superior officer. However, given the circumstances and the evidence we've collected, we also need to investigate allegations of harassment and inappropriate conduct by Captain Brennan. I need you to tell me, in your own words, exactly what happened yesterday." Sarah took a deep breath and began recounting the events in the gymnasium, but Martinez encouraged her to go further back, to describe the pattern of interactions she had experienced with Captain Brennan over the previous months.
As she spoke, referring frequently to her detailed documentation, a disturbing picture emerged of systematic harassment that had escalated over time. Sarah described incidents where Brennan had made inappropriate comments about her physical appearance, questioned her fitness for military service based solely on her gender, and created arbitrary obstacles to her success in training exercises. She recounted times when he had used excessive physical force during demonstrations, made her repeat exercises far beyond what was required of male cadets, and publicly humiliated her in front of her peers. The incident in the gymnasium wasn't isolated. It was the culmination of 8 months of increasingly inappropriate behavior. When I saw his hand coming toward my face, I realized that he had finally crossed a line that I couldn't ignore. Major Williams asked several follow-up questions that helped establish the timeline and pattern of harassment. Cadet Mitchell, why didn't you file a formal complaint earlier? The Academy has procedures in place for reporting inappropriate conduct by faculty members. Sarah's answer revealed one of the most troubling aspects of the situation. Ma'am, I was afraid that filing a complaint would be seen as weakness or inability to handle the pressures of military training. Captain Brennan always made his harassment seem like legitimate military discipline. He was very careful to couch his inappropriate comments in terms that could be interpreted as professional feedback. And when other cadets were present, he would often make his worst comments in ways that only I could hear clearly. This revelation highlighted a problem that went far beyond Captain Brennan's individual behavior. The Academy's culture and reporting procedures had inadvertently created an environment where cadets, especially female cadets, felt unable to seek help when they were being harassed by faculty members. Meanwhile, in another conference room, Captain Brennan was being interviewed by a team that included Martinez's deputy, Major Robert Chen, and the Academy's legal officer, Colonel Janet Morrison. Brennan's account of events differed significantly from Sarah's, and the inconsistencies were becoming increasingly apparent as the investigation progressed. According to Brennan, Sarah had been a problematic cadet from the beginning of the academic year. He characterized her as argumentative, unable to accept criticism, and unsuited for military service. He insisted that all his interactions with her had been appropriate and within the bounds of normal military discipline. Colonel Morrison, Brennan said, "This cadet has been looking for an excuse to file false allegations against me since the beginning of the semester. She clearly planned this entire incident to make me look bad and advance her own agenda." But when Colonel Morrison began asking specific questions about the incidents documented in Sarah's log, Brennan's responses became increasingly evasive. When shown video footage of his behavior during the gymnasium demonstration, he struggled to explain why his actions had deviated so significantly from standard training protocols. Colonel Brennan, Colonel Morrison said, reviewing the footage on a laptop computer, "Can you explain why you maintained such a tight grip on Cadet Mitchell that she was unable to execute the defensive techniques she was supposed to demonstrate?" Brennan watched the footage with growing discomfort. Seeing his own behavior from an outside perspective made it clear that his actions had been inappropriate and unprofessional. "I was trying to create a realistic training scenario," he said weakly. "Real-world situations don't allow for perfect technique execution. Captain, this was supposed to be an educational demonstration, not a real-world confrontation. Your job was to help Cadet Mitchell successfully demonstrate the defensive techniques for the benefit of the other cadets. Instead, you actively prevented her from doing so while making comments that appeared designed to humiliate her." The contrast between Sarah's detailed, consistent account and Brennan's increasingly contradictory explanations was becoming stark. More damaging still were the witness statements that were pouring in from other cadets who had observed various incidents over the previous months. Cadet Marcus Johnson provided not only video footage but also testimony about other incidents he had witnessed. "Sir, I've seen Captain Brennan treat Cadet Mitchell differently than other cadets on multiple occasions. He would make her repeat exercises that he accepted from male cadets on the first attempt. He would criticize her performance using language that seemed designed to be personally hurtful rather than professionally instructive.
Similar testimony came from dozens of other cadets who had observed Brennan's interactions with Sarah over time. What emerged was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond normal military discipline and entered the realm of personal harassment and potential discrimination.
As the investigation continued into its second day, the scope and complexity of the case became increasingly apparent. What had started as a simple incident of a cadet physically confronting a superior officer was evolving into a comprehensive examination of the Academy's culture, policies, and procedures for handling harassment and discrimination. Colonel Morrison, the Academy's legal officer, was particularly concerned about the broader implications of the case. If the investigation concluded that Captain Brennan had engaged in systematic harassment and that the Academy's systems had failed to protect Sarah from that harassment, it could result in significant legal liability and damage to the institution's reputation. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, she said during a private briefing, "We need to be prepared for the possibility that this case could attract national attention. The combination of military hierarchy, gender discrimination, and physical confrontation is exactly the kind of story that media outlets love to cover." Martinez nodded grimly. He had reached the same conclusion. "Colonel, based on the evidence we've collected so far, I believe we're looking at a clear case of harassment that escalated to the point where a cadet felt compelled to defend herself physically. The question is how we handle this in a way that ensures justice for all parties while protecting the Academy's mission and reputation." The investigation was also revealing troubling gaps in the Academy's oversight and reporting systems. Several faculty members admitted during interviews that they had observed inappropriate interactions between Brennan and various cadets, but had not reported them through official channels. The reasons varied. Some thought it wasn't their place to intervene. Others assumed that the behavior was within the bounds of normal military discipline, and still others simply didn't want to create problems for a colleague. Major Thompson, who had been present during the gymnasium incident, provided particularly important testimony. "I've worked with Captain Brennan for 3 years," he told the investigating team. "I've always known him to be a demanding instructor, but what I witnessed in that gymnasium was different. His behavior toward Cadet Mitchell seemed personal rather than professional. When she questioned his methods, his reaction was disproportionate and inappropriate." This testimony from a fellow faculty member was especially damaging to Brennan's case because it came from someone who had no apparent motivation to lie or exaggerate. Major Thompson's account corroborated Sarah's version of events and provided professional military perspective on what constituted appropriate versus inappropriate instructional behavior. As word of the investigation spread beyond the Academy, Sarah found herself dealing with a different kind of pressure. Military blogs and social media platforms were beginning to discuss the case, and opinions were sharply divided. Some commentators praised her for standing up to harassment and abuse of authority. Others criticized her for undermining military discipline and hierarchy. The attention was overwhelming for a 20-year-old cadet who had simply been trying to complete her military education. Sarah found herself thrust into a spotlight she never wanted, representing larger issues about women in the military, harassment and institutional settings, and the balance between authority and accountability. Jennifer Walsh continued to provide crucial support during this difficult period. "Sarah, I know this is scary and overwhelming, but you need to remember that you didn't choose to be in this situation. Captain Brennan's behavior forced you into a position where you had to defend yourself. You're not responsible for the fact that defending yourself created a larger controversy." But Sarah was struggling with the moral complexity of her situation. Even if she had been justified in defending herself, even if Brennan had been harassing her for months, the fact remained that she had used physical force against a superior officer. That violated every principle of military hierarchy and discipline that she had been raised to respect. "Jen, what if I was wrong? What if there was another way to handle this that didn't involve physical confrontation? What if I just made things worse for every female cadet who comes after me?" These doubts were compounded by the mixed reactions she was receiving from other cadets. While many were supportive, others were clearly uncomfortable with what she had done.
Some male cadets worried that the incident would result in increased scrutiny of all instructor-cadet interactions, making training more difficult and less realistic. Some female cadets worried that Sarah's actions would create a backlash against women in the military generally. The pressure was intense enough that Major Williams, Sarah's appointed advocate, recommended that she speak with the Academy's counseling services. Cadet Mitchell, you're dealing with trauma from months of harassment, stress from the investigation, and pressure from public attention. It's important that you have professional support during this process. Sarah was initially reluctant to seek counseling, viewing it as another sign of weakness in an environment where strength and resilience were prized above all else. But Major Williams explained that seeking help was actually a sign of maturity and good judgment. Sarah, the strongest leaders are those who recognize when they need support and aren't afraid to ask for it. Dealing with this situation alone would be unwise and unnecessary. The counseling sessions proved to be helpful in ways Sarah hadn't expected. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the Academy's chief psychologist, helped her process not just the immediate trauma of the gymnasium incident, but also the cumulative stress of months of harassment and the pressure of suddenly becoming a public figure. Sarah, what you experienced with Captain Brennan is a textbook example of what psychologists call institutional harassment. It's a pattern of behavior designed to make you feel isolated, vulnerable, and unable to seek help. Your response wasn't an overreaction. It was the natural result of being pushed beyond reasonable limits by someone who abused his position of authority. These sessions helped Sarah gain perspective on her situation and develop coping strategies for dealing with the ongoing investigation and public attention.
By the third day of the investigation, the evidence against Captain Brennan had become overwhelming. The combination of video footage, detailed documentation, witness testimony, and expert analysis painted a clear picture of systematic harassment that had escalated to the point of attempted physical assault. Colonel Morrison and Lieutenant Colonel Martinez were preparing to make recommendations that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. But the investigation had also revealed broader, systemic issues that the Academy administration could no longer ignore. The fact that multiple faculty members had observed inappropriate behavior, but failed to report it, suggested serious problems with the Academy's culture and oversight mechanisms. The fact that Sarah had felt unable to file a formal complaint, despite months of harassment, indicated that the Academy's reporting procedures were inadequate and potentially intimidating to cadets. Academy Superintendent General Patricia Hayes called an emergency meeting of the senior staff to discuss not just the immediate case, but the broader reforms that would be necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future. General Hayes was a decorated combat veteran who had spent her entire career fighting for women's equality in the military, and she understood that this case represented both a crisis and an opportunity. "Gentlemen and ladies," she began, addressing the assembled staff, "this incident has forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our institution. We have failed in our duty to protect all cadets from harassment and abuse. We have created an environment where reporting inappropriate behavior is seen as weakness rather than courage. And we have allowed a culture to develop where some faculty members feel entitled to treat certain cadets as less than equal." The meeting lasted for over 4 hours and resulted in a comprehensive action plan that would transform many aspects of Academy life. New policies would be implemented requiring mandatory reporting of observed harassment, expanded training for faculty on appropriate instructor-cadet relationships, and the creation of an independent ombudsman office where cadets could report problems without fear of retaliation. But the immediate question remained: what would happen to Sarah and Captain Brennan? The evidence clearly supported Sarah's account of events. The video footage showed that Brennan had raised his hand toward her face in an aggressive manner before she responded with physical force. Under military law, any person, regardless of rank, had the right to defend themselves against unprovoked physical aggression. Sarah's response, while dramatic, appeared to be legally justified self-defense.
Captain Brennan's situation was far more serious. The investigation had documented a clear pattern of harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority. His behavior in the gymnasium constituted attempted assault on a subordinate, which was a serious criminal offense under military law. His systematic harassment of Sarah over 8 months represented a violation of multiple military regulations and potentially federal anti-discrimination laws. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the gymnasium incident, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez called Sarah into his office to inform her of the investigation's conclusions and recommendations. Cadet Mitchell, he began, after a thorough investigation involving video evidence, witness testimony, expert analysis, and detailed documentation, we have concluded that your actions in the gymnasium were justified self-defense against an unprovoked assault by Captain Brennan. No charges will be filed against you, and this incident will not appear on your permanent record as a disciplinary matter. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The possibility of court-martial and dismissal from the academy had been weighing on her for days. But Martinez wasn't finished. However, he continued, I want you to understand that your actions that day, while legally justified, required tremendous courage. You stood up to systematic harassment and abuse when our institutional systems failed to protect you. You defended yourself when someone in a position of authority tried to harm you, and you did all of this knowing that it could end your military career. Martinez paused and looked directly at Sarah. Cadet Mitchell, that kind of moral courage is exactly what we hope to develop in our future officers. You have demonstrated the kind of character that the military needs in its leaders. The meeting concluded with Martinez explaining the broader changes that would be implemented at the academy as a result of the investigation. Sarah would be given the opportunity to transfer to a different training company if she preferred, and she would have access to ongoing counseling and support services. But perhaps most importantly, she would be given the opportunity to participate in developing new policies and procedures for preventing and addressing harassment. Her experience and insights would help ensure that future cadets would not have to endure what she had experienced. Cadet Mitchell, Martinez said as the meeting concluded, you have the opportunity to turn this traumatic experience into something positive that benefits every cadet who comes after you. I hope you'll consider taking on that responsibility. Meanwhile, Captain Brennan was meeting with Colonel Morrison to learn the fate that awaited him. The news was not good. He would face court-martial on charges of assault, harassment, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of federal anti-discrimination laws. If convicted, he could face dismissal from the military, loss of pension benefits, and potentially prison time. The contrast between the two meetings was stark. Sarah, who had begun the week facing potential criminal charges, was being praised for her courage and invited to help reform the institution. Brennan, who had entered the week as a respected faculty member, was facing the end of his military career and potential imprisonment. But the story was far from over. The case would still have to go through the military justice system, and there would undoubtedly be appeals, media attention, and continued scrutiny of the Academy's culture and policies.
The court-martial of Captain Richard Brennan began 6 weeks later in a packed military courtroom that had drawn attention from across the country. Military justice proceedings are typically closed affairs, but the high-profile nature of this case and its implications for military culture had generated intense media interest. The courtroom was filled with journalists, military personnel, women's rights advocates, and family members of both Sarah and Captain Brennan. Sarah, now represented by a team of military defense attorneys, would serve as the primary witness for the prosecution. The months since the gymnasium incident had been difficult for her, but she had grown stronger and more confident as she prepared to testify about her experiences. The support she had received from fellow cadets, faculty members, and advocates from around the country had helped her understand that her case was about much more than just her individual experience. Captain Brennan's defense team,
led by a prominent civilian attorney experienced in military law, had developed a strategy focused on questioning Sarah's motivations and character. They would argue that she had manufactured the harassment allegations to cover up her own inappropriate behavior, and that her physical response to Brennan had been disproportionate and unjustified. But this defense strategy proved problematic from the very beginning. The video evidence was simply too clear, Sarah's documentation too detailed, and the witness testimony too consistent to support claims that the harassment had been fabricated. Moreover, the defense team's attempts to attack Sarah's character backfired by making her appear even more sympathetic to the jury of military officers who would decide Brennan's fate. The prosecution, led by Major David Park, methodically presented evidence of Brennan's pattern of harassment over 8 months. They showed video footage of the gymnasium incident from multiple angles, presented Sarah's detailed documentation of inappropriate interactions, and called witness after witness who testified about Brennan's inappropriate behavior toward female cadets. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when Dr. Elizabeth Carter, the Academy psychologist, testified about the psychological impact of institutional harassment. She explained how Brennan's behavior fit classic patterns of abuse designed to isolate victims and make them feel powerless to seek help. Captain Brennan's actions toward Cadet Mitchell were not random or impulsive. They represented a calculated pattern of harassment designed to undermine her confidence, isolate her from support systems, and create an environment where she felt unable to seek help through official channels, Dr. Carter testified. The defense team's cross-examination of Dr. Carter focused on trying to establish that Sarah should have reported the harassment through official channels rather than documenting it privately. But this line of questioning only served to highlight the Academy's inadequate reporting procedures and the culture of intimidation that had prevented Sarah from seeking help. Sarah's own testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Over 2 days on the witness stand, she calmly and methodically described 8 months of escalating harassment, the psychological toll it had taken on her, and the moment in the gymnasium when she realized she had to defend herself. I didn't want to hurt Captain Brennan. I didn't want to create a scene or embarrass him in front of 189 of my fellow cadets. But when I saw his hand coming toward my face, I realized that all the months of trying to endure his harassment, all the times I had told myself to just be strong and push through it, had led to this moment where he felt entitled to physically assault me. I couldn't let that happen. The defense team's cross-examination of Sarah was aggressive and sometimes hostile, clearly designed to rattle her and make her appear unstable or vindictive. But Sarah's months of counseling and preparation had given her the tools to remain calm and focused. Her responses were measured, consistent, and compelling. When the defense attorney suggested that she had overreacted to what he characterized as normal military discipline, Sarah's response was particularly powerful. "Sir, I have been raised in a military family. I understand military discipline, military hierarchy, and military values. What Captain Brennan did to me was not military discipline. It was personal harassment designed to drive me out of the academy because he didn't believe women belonged in military service. Military discipline is about making people better soldiers and better leaders. What Captain Brennan did was designed to tear me down and make me question whether I belonged in uniform." The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning their verdict. Captain Brennan was found guilty on all charges: assault, harassment, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of federal anti-discrimination laws. He was sentenced to dismissal from the military, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and 6 months in military prison. But perhaps more importantly, the trial had served as a catalyst for broader changes in military culture and policy. The extensive media coverage had forced military leadership to confront systemic issues of harassment and discrimination that had been ignored for too long. New policies were implemented across all service branches, requiring mandatory reporting of harassment, expanded training on appropriate conduct, and stronger protections for victims who came forward with complaints. Sarah's courage in standing up to Captain Brennan not only ended his pattern of harassment, but it also created positive changes that would benefit thousands of future service members. The case became a landmark in military justice and a turning point in the ongoing struggle for equality and respect in military institutions.
As she left the courtroom after the verdict was announced, Sarah was surrounded by supporters who had followed her case from around the country. But she was also approached by dozens of current and former military personnel who thanked her for her courage and shared their own stories of harassment and discrimination.
The years that followed the trial saw Sarah Mitchell emerge as one of the most respected officers of her generation, but the path wasn't always easy. Returning to the academy after the trial meant facing a complex mix of reactions from fellow cadets and faculty. Some viewed her as a hero who had stood up for what was right. Others saw her as someone who had disrupted the traditional military order. But regardless of how people viewed her actions, everyone respected the dignity and professionalism with which she handled the aftermath. Sarah threw herself into her studies and training with renewed determination. She graduated second in her class, earned commissions in multiple advanced training programs, and was selected for the Academy's prestigious leadership development track. But perhaps more importantly, she became a mentor and advocate for other cadets who faced harassment or discrimination. The changes implemented at Westfield Military Academy in the wake of the Brennan case transformed the institution's culture in ways that went far beyond anti-harassment policies. The academy established an ombudsman office where cadets could report problems confidentially, implemented mandatory bystander intervention training for all personnel, and created support networks for cadets from underrepresented groups. Sarah played a crucial role in developing many of these programs. She worked with Academy leadership to design training curricula that helped cadets and faculty understand the difference between legitimate military discipline and inappropriate harassment. She participated in orientation programs for new female cadets, sharing her story and providing support for those who might face similar challenges. The goal isn't to make military training easier or less demanding, Sarah would tell new cadets. The goal is to ensure that everyone is challenged based on their potential as future officers, not based on their gender, race, or any other irrelevant characteristic. Military discipline should build people up and make them stronger, not tear them down or drive them away. The impact of Sarah's case extended far beyond Westfield Academy. Military installations across all service branches began reviewing their own policies and procedures for handling harassment and discrimination. The Department of Defense commissioned comprehensive studies on military culture and implemented new training requirements for all personnel. Sarah's story became a case study in military justice courses, leadership development programs, and ethics training across the military. Her actions were held up as an example of moral courage, the willingness to do what's right, even when it's difficult or costly. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from the hundreds of service members who reached out to Sarah over the years to thank her for her courage and to share their own stories. Many had faced similar harassment, but had felt powerless to address it. Sarah's willingness to stand up to Captain Brennan had shown them that it was possible to challenge inappropriate behavior even when it came from someone in authority. One letter that particularly moved Sarah came from a female Marine who had enlisted several years after the Brennan case. She wrote, "I've never met you, but your story gave me the courage to report harassment I was experiencing from a sergeant in my unit. Because of the changes that resulted from your case, my complaint was taken seriously and addressed quickly. I probably would have left the military if I hadn't known that there were people like you who had fought to make things better." Captain Brennan's life took a very different trajectory. After serving his 6-month prison sentence, he was dismissed from the military and stripped of all benefits. He struggled to find employment in the civilian world, as his military record made it difficult to obtain security clearances or positions in defense-related industries. He eventually found work as a security guard and later as a supervisor in a warehouse, but he never achieved the kind of career success he had enjoyed in the military. In a strange twist, Brennan actually reached out to Sarah several years after the trial. Through intermediaries, he requested a meeting where he could apologize for his behavior and acknowledge the harm he had caused. Sarah agreed to meet with him, accompanied by a counselor and a military chaplain. The meeting was difficult for both of them. Brennan struggled to articulate the reasons for his behavior, acknowledging that his treatment of Sarah and other female cadets had been inappropriate and harmful. He expressed regret for his actions and gratitude that Sarah's courage had forced him to confront his own prejudices and inappropriate behavior.
I destroyed my own career and hurt a lot of people because I couldn't accept that the military was changing, he told Sarah. I let my own insecurities and prejudices turn me into someone I shouldn't have been. I'm grateful that you had the courage to stop me before I hurt even more people. Sarah accepted his apology, but made it clear that his behavior had caused real harm that couldn't simply be erased by expressions of regret. However, she also encouraged him to use his experience to help others understand the impact of harassment and discrimination. Sarah eventually rose to the rank of colonel and commanded multiple units with distinction. She served tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, earned advanced degrees in international relations and military strategy, and was recognized with numerous awards for her leadership and service. But throughout her career, she remained committed to mentoring other service members and advocating for fair treatment and equal opportunity. When Sarah retired from active duty after 25 years of service, she was invited to speak at graduation ceremonies at military academies across the country. Her message was always the same. True strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it's difficult or costly. Military service is about more than following orders and maintaining discipline, she would tell new graduating classes. It's about honor, integrity, and the courage to protect not just our country, but also our fellow service members. Sometimes that means standing up to people who abuse their authority, even when those people outrank you. The gymnasium incident that had threatened to end Sarah's military career before it really began had instead become the defining moment that shaped her into one of the most respected leaders of her generation. Her willingness to draw a line and defend herself against harassment had not only protected her own dignity, but had also created positive changes that benefited thousands of other service members. The 189 witnesses who had watched Sarah pin Captain Brennan to the gymnasium floor had seen more than just a physical confrontation. They had witnessed a moment when someone refused to accept treatment that diminished their humanity and dignity. They had seen courage in action, and many of them carried that lesson with them throughout their own military careers. Today, nearly 30 years later, Sarah's story continues to inspire new generations of service members who face their own challenges in military institutions that are still evolving towards true equality and respect for all personnel. Her exploit proves that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the prejudices and abuses of power that can undermine the values that military service is supposed to represent. The captain had tried to slap her, but in the end, it was Sarah who delivered the knockout blow, not just to him, but to a system that had allowed harassment and discrimination to flourish unchallenged for too long. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.